as the summer draws to an end, every year you get me for a couple of Sundays. Seems like that. It's almost like Christmas. Well, it's not Christmas in August, but it's just with the regularity of it. I want to read this morning a few verses from Exodus 16. And a little bit of a theme that I want to talk about over the 2 Sundays, Lord willing, which will be bread. And just as we're giving thanks for the bread, some of this was touched on. So today I want to talk about the story of the manna from Exodus 16, and then next Sunday, God willing, to look at one of the gospel accounts of the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus does this healing miracle, which obviously points to who he is as the living bread that's come down from heaven. Yesterday, I found myself yesterday in twice yesterday morning in queues for bread. It's not a normal Saturday morning activity for me, but there's a French bakery in Moira, and they only open like a couple of days a week or something, and every Saturday morning you'll see people queued up on the street to get in. Apparently this is a thing across Britain generally, is these bakeries that do special breads. And then a little later there was a food fair in Moira, and again I found myself queuing for bread. And it struck me thinking about it, it's a strange thing. When you see people queuing for bread, there are 2 extreme reasons for it. One is in cases of poverty and lack, where there's famine and people don't have bread. And whatever maybe little amounts of bread there are, they queue for it. The other is the opposite. And it's actually people who maybe have enough money, obviously, to pay £5 for a big loaf. You wouldn't necessarily do that every day, even if it was open every day. But I thought it was a strange thing that there's both the lack and there's the plenty. And in both instances, people are queuing. Well, the background to the story in Exodus 16 is a lack of bread. And next week as well, we'll see that there was a lack of bread. But things changed dramatically in both instances. So I want to read, not going to read the whole chapter, but I want to refer to various parts of it. So we'll just read enough of it to give us a sense of what's going on. So Exodus 16, the whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they'd come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you've brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days." Now go down to verse 13. That evening, quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they didn't know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent." The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some gathered little. And when they measured it by the omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. And then down to verse 31. The people of Israel called the bread manna. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Take an omer of manna and keep it for the generations to come, so that they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt." So Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar, put an omer of manna in it, then place it before the Lord to be kept for the generations to come." As the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron put the manna with the tablets of the covenant law so that it might be preserved. The Israelites ate manna 40 years until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. And that's what we'll read. And may God bless his word to us. So we're going to talk a little bit about this bread that is given to the Israelites. Hugely significant in their story. So significant, in fact, that as you see at the end of the chapter, they were to keep a portion of manna, just so that they would always remember. We've been talking about remembrance this morning, but just so that they would always remember the way God had provided them during these desert years. We know from the Psalms that the manna would eventually be referred to as the bread of angels, or the bread of heaven. And I want to make a few observations about it. I think about just four observations about it, and the focus mainly on the first three, and then the fourth one will really set us up for next Sunday. But the first thing I want you to notice is that the manna was provision. It was a provision in the desert. It was a provision in the desert. So if you look back to the beginning of the chapter, you'll see that the setting of this is the desert. It's the desert of sin. It's the second of the deserts that the Israelites have encountered since they left Egypt. The first one is Shur, which you find described towards the end of chapter 15. And in the desert of Shur, there was a problem of a lack of water. Here, there was a lack of food. So you'll notice that they have left Elim, and that's the place where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees. They've left that, and they're on this journey, and they're traveling to Sinai, which is the place where they're going to receive the law. So two very significant places. Elim, place of security and provision, and Sinai, which was going to be another landmark where they would encounter God, and he would give them the 10 Commandments. But at the moment, they're in a in-between place. They're neither in one place nor in another. And that's what deserts are like, isn't it? You travel through them for the most part. They're like a no man's land. You maybe have left one place, but you haven't yet arrived in the other. Now, with deserts, the problem with them, not only are they in between places, but there's a vulnerability about deserts because they're precarious places. There is no food supply there. There's nothing to provide for you. And clearly, as they traveled through this desert, in the precariousness of the desert, the people felt the vulnerability of it. There was nothing to eat. And as far as they were concerned, they were just headed for this very slow, very uncomfortable death. And the way they talk about it, they're thinking to themselves, do you know, maybe it would have been better if the Lord had just wiped us all out in Egypt the way he wiped out the Egyptians. In fact, as they thought about the past, it's interesting that it seems that the past has become something that it wasn't. So if you look at verse 3, the Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt, there we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you've brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Now, they say that the past is not what it used to be. You know, you think about that. And nostalgia is, of course, a thing of the past. And isn't it very interesting what happens with these people as they think back to Egypt? And it happens elsewhere as well in their story. As they look back, it seems like Egypt was an amazing place. And they're saying, well, you know, we got as much meat as we wanted to eat. It was wonderful. There we were, sitting around pots of meat, eating as much as we wanted. And I think we need to be a little bit careful sometimes when we look back. And I think all of us, as we get older, we do tend to look back a little bit. And I think we need to realize that sometimes when we look back at other eras, we think to ourselves, you know, those were the good old days. It was so amazing, and maybe they were to some extent. But our memories sometimes can color the things that we recall. It's interesting that the book of Ecclesiastes warns us about nostalgia. It says, don't ask why the old days were better than these days. Interesting, isn't it? So they're here, they're looking back, they're thinking about Egypt. They're in this place of vulnerability, but it becomes a place of grumbling. They've left God out of it. They've forgotten ways that he has provided for them. He's rescued them from Egypt. The Red Sea has been separated so that they're able to walk through. He has sweetened the bitter waters of Marah in chapter 15. He's been with them in cloud and fire, and yet they've forgotten all of that and they grumble. They grumble at Moses and Aaron, but in fact, they're grumbling against God. And that's the problem. They're actually grumbling against the Lord because they've lost sight of what he has done for them. So against that background of realizing their vulnerability and their grumbling ultimately against God, it's against that background that we're introduced to the manna. So God speaks in verse 4, and he says that he's going to act, and once he acts, the people will know who he is. That's an important theme in the book of Exodus. And so every day, apart from the Sabbath, there's going to be bread from heaven. They'd have to go and get it. It wasn't going to be delivered to their tents. They were going to have to go and get it, but it would be there. And it would taste like cakes made with honey. Sounds wonderful if you like the taste of honey. And there would be enough for everyone. No one would have too much. No one would have too little. So here they are in this in-between place of vulnerability and grumbling. And it's going to be transformed and become a place of provision and grace. And I think it's really interesting the way Scripture talks about their desert experience, because it talks about it in contrasting ways. It's a precarious place where you wonder where your next meal's coming from, and yet it becomes a place of provision. It's a place of fearfulness. How are we going to find anything to eat? How are we going to survive here? Are we just going to die in this desert? And yet, in that place of fearfulness, it's the place where they were going to learn about the faithfulness of God. And the manna would become one way that God would demonstrate his generous provision for his people. Now, a little later, quite a bit later in the history of the Israelites, book of Nehemiah, chapter 9, Nehemiah looks back on this, and he says, in a great prayer, he says, because of your great compassion, you did not abandon them in the wilderness. By day, the pillar of cloud did not fail to guide them on their path, nor the pillar of fire by night to shine on the way that they were to take. You gave your good spirit to instruct them. You did not withhold your manna from their mouths, and you gave them water from their thirst, for their thirst. And we also learn, of course, that their clothes didn't wear out, nor did the sandals on their feet. So it's a place of provision, this desert. It's a place of provision. The manna is a sign of God's provision in the desert. And isn't it the same kind of dependence that the Lord wants us to live in? And we maybe don't feel that we are in such a precarious place, and yet we're taught to pray, give us today our daily bread. Most of us are cushioned from daily dependence, aren't we? Because, well, when you think about daily bread, well, actually we can say, well, we can buy a nice Hovis pan or pan loaf or something like that, and it's got enough chemicals in it that it'll last for about 2 weeks without going off. So bread isn't really daily, is it? It's there. But Jesus wants us to live in this sense of daily dependence. And prayer is a way of helping us to acknowledge our dependence on God and remember his faithfulness. So the manna reminds us of the faithfulness of God. It was provision in the desert. Second thing to notice is that the manna was a lesson in trust. So it's provision in the desert, reminds us of God's faithfulness, but it's also a lesson in trust. During these years in the desert, the people were learning lots of things. They were learning about who God was. And they also had some very practical lessons that needed to learn. They had to learn how to trust, and they had to learn how to obey. And the way they had to learn to trust was because the desert removes props, the props. And sometimes in life, the props are taken away, aren't they? Things that we use to provide for ourselves, things that we use to cushion ourselves against danger. I think many of us, maybe most of us, have a built-in instinct to protect ourselves. Well, we do have a built-in instinct to protect ourselves against danger. In some of us, that's maybe more extreme than others. But I would imagine that if we were to have a show of hands about how many people in the room have jumped out of an airplane with a parachute, I imagine it would be very, very small, if any. Simply bungee jumping. If I don't know, if there's probably not very many, if any, have bungee jumped. We tend to not take risks. We like to protect ourselves from risk and danger. And of course, when we put all these cushions around ourselves and all these props are there, very easily they lead to us forgetting our dependence on God. The thing that God is using the manna to teach them about his provision. If we surround ourselves with all kinds of cushions, then we forget our dependence on God. Sometimes the cushions get taken away and the props get taken away. I can remember a number of years ago going through a time of particular ministry challenge, which was a very unsettling time, raised all kinds of questions about the future. And the Lord really spoke to me very clearly from 2 Corinthians chapter 1. And it was from the experience of Paul that he talks about in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. He writes very personally, as you probably know, in 2 Corinthians. And he's reflecting on some of the desperate trouble that he had experienced. Far more serious challenges than anything that I was facing. Huge challenges. Challenges that were more really than he could actually bear. But he came to understand something, and this is how he put it. He said, this happened so that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. And if we never find ourselves confronted with a situation that is beyond our ability to fix, then we will always be limited in the extent that we depend on God. Paul could only lean on God in the circumstances in which he found himself. And here are the Israelites learning this lesson of trust. If God didn't turn up for them, they were going to be very hungry. If God didn't turn up for them for a while, they were going to die of starvation. And so every day that they left their tents to go hunting for manna was a reminder of their vulnerability. Imagine waking up in the morning and thinking, oh, it was there yesterday and the day before. But what happens if something's gone wrong and it's not there today? What are we going to do? It was a reminder of their vulnerability. And yet when they went out, it was always there. Just enough of it. It seems that as they went out, they gathered. So verse 17, some gathered much, some gathered little. When they measured it, the one who gathered much didn't have too much. The one who gathered little didn't have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. And perhaps there was an element of the miraculous in that, rather than them being so calculated and so accurate in their calculations. But every day there was enough for everyone, just what everybody needed. Every sixth day, there'd be twice as much. And remarkably, unlike every other day, what you gathered on the sixth day was still edible on the seventh day. If you tried that any other day, tried it day one, it wouldn't be any good on day two. Some people tried that. But it would still be edible on day 7 because there wasn't going to be anything on day 7. And all of it was to teach them to trust the Lord. Now again, as people reflected back, as Moses reflected back on these days, in Deuteronomy chapter 8, here's what he said. He humbled you, causing you to hunger and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes out of the mouth of God. Now, don't we often, I've maybe said this here before, but don't we often think of this verse, and we think it's got something to do with, well, you have your breakfast in the morning, whether it's your bread that you toast or whether it's your cereal or whatever it might be, but you don't live on bread alone. So when you have your breakfast in the morning, you're having your physical food, make sure you read your Bible as well, because you need your spiritual food. And while there's great value in that, I don't think that that's necessarily the emphasis in Deuteronomy chapter 8. I think the emphasis is more likely to be, Moses is saying, you needed to learn that it's not bread that keeps you alive. It is the fact that God speaks and gives you that bread. That is what keeps you alive. The bread is secondary, but the Lord who sends it is primary. And they had to learn it in the place of vulnerability. So the manna was provision in the desert, And it was a lesson in trust. They were learning to trust God. They were learning to depend on God to take care of them. And the third thing that I want you to notice then is that the manna was a test of obedience. Trust and obedience often go together, don't they? Now you'll notice that there are two groups of people who decided they would ignore the instructions that had been given to them. The first ones you'll find in verse 20. Moses says in verse 19, no one is to keep any of it until morning. However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was very angry at them. Were these the folks who thought, we don't want to have to be bothered getting up every morning and going out and collecting it. Let's just gather twice as much as we need. And sure, once we've done that, we can take the day off. The next day we can take the day off. So we'll only have to go out every other day or something like that. Well, it was rotten. It was full of maggots, and it began to smell. So that was one group. The other group come in verse 27, and these are the people who go out on the seventh day to gather it, but they found none. So they're going out on the seventh day. They're the opposite. They're actually going out on a day when they're not supposed to go out. They're the opposite from the people in verse 20. And you wonder why they went out. Were they worried that maybe it wouldn't be what they'd gathered the day before wouldn't be fresh enough? Maybe they get a little bit of a bonus? The way you have maybe your Sunday lunch is bigger than you normally eat during the course of the week. Did they think the Sabbath would be a good day to eat a little bit extra? But they go out and there's nothing there. And Moses again has to speak to them about that. The Lord speaks to Moses, in fact, in verse 28, and says, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and instructions? And then bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That's why on the sixth day he gives you bread for 2 days. Now it's interesting that the principles of the Sabbath are being set down even before the law has been given. It goes all the way back to God and creation. But every day they're learning about trust in the faithful provision of God, and every day they're being tested about their obedience. So they've been tested on their faith, and they've been tested in terms of their obedience. Now I've already highlighted Deuteronomy 8 verse 3. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes out of the mouth of God. Now, where else do you find that in Scripture? Well, you find it in the story of the temptation of Jesus, don't you? Matthew 4. Jesus fasts for 40 days and 40 nights. 40 is significant. It's a key number in Scripture. And for one thing, it's an echo of the 40 wilderness years of the Israelites. And the previous verse has just said that, in Deuteronomy 8, has said that the Lord led them in the wilderness to test them so that he would know what was in their heart, whether or not they would keep his commands. And of course, the Lord knew what was in their hearts, but this was going to make it obvious what was in their hearts. And overall, the people of Israel failed. It wasn't just in terms of the manna, but so many tests throughout the wilderness years. And they failed. They failed to trust God, and they failed to obey him. Ultimately, when they refused to go into the promised land. So when you see Jesus now being tempted in the wilderness, it's as though we're meant to say, well, we've seen what happened when Israel was in the wilderness and when Israel was tested in the wilderness, and they failed the test. And the echoes in terms of the numbers and in terms of the quotations from the book of Deuteronomy help us to see that here's Jesus stepping into the place where Israel was and failed. Now, here's Jesus. What will be in his heart when he is tested? And of course, we see that he will obey his Father. 3 specific temptations. The first had to do with bread. What do you do when you're hungry and you're in the desert? Israel grumbled. Jesus didn't grumble. Jesus trusted his Father and trusted his Father's time to give him food when it would be time. Jesus said no to the temptation He chose obedience and dependence. It's not just bread that keeps you alive, it's the provision of God. So the manna reminds us that God is providing for people in this place of vulnerability. It is a lesson in trust. It's learning in that place of vulnerability to trust and depend on God. But it's also then this lesson in obedience, because we demonstrate our trust in our obedience to God. And the final thing is that the manna was a pointer to Jesus. Now, we've already seen it in the temptations, in the way that the temptations are previews of, or the temptations of Jesus are echoes of what happened to Israel, that story of the temptation of Jesus. We've also seen how this all points to Jesus in the prayer that he teaches his disciples. Give us today our daily bread, just like the Israelites are going out of their tents every day and getting their daily bread. But there is this one more thing, and it comes in John chapter 6, and it's the miraculous provision of bread of all things. So all four of the Gospels record the miracle. But there are 5,000 people, 5,000 men, we understand from some of the Gospel writers, besides women and children. And they're fed with 5 loaves and a couple of fish. Amazing. We'll see more about it next week. But just a little further on in that same chapter, in John chapter 6, Jesus says this. We've already had this quoted to us not so long ago. Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, it's not Moses who's given you bread from heaven. You say, well, wait a minute, what? Is that not Moses that we've just been reading about here in Exodus 16? It's not Moses who's given you bread from heaven, but it's my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. This is a different kind of bread, isn't it? We realize that this manna is a picture of something. It's pointing to this true bread that's going to come down from heaven, and it's going to give life to the world. It is not just about God providing physical bread to satisfy the physical hunger of people, but here is spiritual bread that's going to come down and give spiritual life to the people. And the crowd are thinking, well, this sounds amazing, as Jesus talks to them about this. They say, this is amazing. Can you give us some of this bread? And Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. That's where the manna is pointing. The manna was God's gracious provision for hungry people in the wilderness. The loaves and the fish in John 6 were God's provision for hungry people on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And it all points to this fact that Jesus is God's gracious provision for the spiritually hungry. And as the loaves on the shore of the Sea of Galilee were broken and given, so the body of Jesus would be broken and given as God's gracious provision for us, the spiritually needy, the spiritually hungry. He said, your ancestors ate manna and died. But whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. Now, most of us will probably be eating some bread, maybe later today, maybe have a little sandwich for your tea tonight, before you're back out here in Cafe Church. Maybe you eat sandwiches in Cafe Church, I don't know. But we'll probably all eat bread, maybe more than we should, even during the course of the week. You eat garlic bread with your lasagna. A lot of carbs in that. Naan bread with your curry. Just a nice bit of toast for your breakfast, a sandwich for your lunch. Bread, for us, is just an everyday thing, isn't it? And yet, God uses that everyday thing, bread, to remind us about these really significant lessons. He's the one who provides in the places of vulnerability. He's the one who demonstrates his faithfulness in places of fear. He teaches us obedience, to trust him. He teaches us faith, to trust him, to depend on him. And he teaches us obedience as we trust him to demonstrate that. And all through it all, he points us to Jesus, who's the bread of life. And so may God bless his word to us. And let's just pray.